You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to dive back into Carl Jung and his Red Book. As I mentioned last time I was on here, that the Red Book episodes are the longest running series on the Two Tongues Podcast ever. I've been taking my time with it. So literally we've been sprinkling the Red Book in to our normal cadence for years. And these are just kind of my, maybe one of my favorite opinion scholarship episodes, because Carl Jung is one of the most fascinating minds that I've ever encountered. And I'm highly influenced by Jung myself. So for those of you who might be jumping in, if this is the first Gandalf the Red episode you've listened to, let me just tee it up a little bit for you. So I'm going to show you a picture. It's one of my favorite paintings. This is a painting called Saint Jerome at his Study, or Saint Jerome Writing, something like that, by Caravaggio. So if you guys don't know Caravaggio, I love the way he painted this style. I don't know if it's Baroque or what you call it, but as you can see, very, very dark, really interesting use of shadows. So it looks very lifelike, but also there's always this touch of very bold color. And so in this case, it's this red robe draped over St. Jerome. Then you can see his ancient tomes that he's reading and writing, and the skull that's kind of tucked in the back in the shadows. And whenever I read the Red Book, and whenever I think about the process that Carl Jung went through to write it, this is the image that comes to mind. So I realize, that Carl Jung is a much more modern man than the image we're looking on the screen here. But, there's like lots of little interesting connections. I mean, first of all, we're talking about the Red Book, and it's red for a reason. We're talking about Carl Jung, and so everything is symbolic and significant in kind of layers. And so we have Carl Jung's Red Book, and we have this red robe draped over St. Jerome. But really mainly what I want to point out here is you've got this very sagely figure, this, gray bearded old man who has wisdom that is hard earned and is just simply unavailable among younger people. And so you have this sort of image of embodied wisdom and a life's work of, reading and questing after some sacred knowledge. And this is exactly what Carl Jung was doing, and maybe even not far from how he would describe it himself. So what we're dealing with here is Carl Jung's active imagination. He is putting himself into something like a hypnotic state or a dreamlike state, and it's something like what you might call lucid dreaming. So he's sort of self-inducing himself into a type of hypnosis where he gets into a dreamlike state, and he starts tapping into the unconscious, where all the mysteries are, the mysteries of being and consciousness and all of this. So he's dredging up order from chaos, you might say. He's dredging up valuable things from the unconscious, and this is always the image that comes to mind. So I like to sort of replace St. Jerome with Carl Jung, take away the beard, give him that little German mustache. Well, I guess German mustache might be a risky way of putting it, but not talking about a Hitler mustache. I'm talking about Carl Jung mustache, but drape that red cloak over him, put those ancient tomes in the skull there, and this, maybe even light a candle, get a little ambiance. And this is what I imagine Carl Jung is doing. And so what we're going to do is pick up where we left off. Okay, here we are. So I'm going to call this Gandalf the Red Part 10. Not entirely sure what the subtitle will be. I'll probably add one. But this is picking up right where we left off in Part 9. And I'll give you a little bit of a recap. So just my own takeaways from reading. This is going to cover like 3 chapters of the Red Book. This has been my favorite sequence of visions so far in the Red Book, and we're just a little bit more than halfway in. To me, these three visions unfold very much like a folk tale or a fairy tale. And for that reason, they're some of my favorite visions so far. A feeling came over me when I was reading them. And it doesn't always happen, and it's sort of hard to describe, but it does happen from time to time. And I think of it as like an unconscious recognition of something sacred. Like you might get the hair standing up on your arms or something and not understand why. You have a physiological reaction to something and you're not quite sure what it is. It's something like that that's happening when I read the Red Book. It's as if something of the deepest reality is being conveyed, and I recognize that it's meaningful without understanding precisely why or how. Now, the first time I remember feeling this way, I was probably 12 or 13. I sat down to read the book of Revelation for the first time. It's like this, mysterious book at the end of the Bible, and never really cracked it open before. And so reading the book of Revelation at that age was kind of like, I don't know, man. I don't know if I'd call it risque, but it was like maybe something I shouldn't have been doing. At least that's how it felt for me. So maybe it was like a little naughty or something, reading this book about the, Armageddon or whatever. But this gives you some idea of what you're in for today. Like reading this gave me that same feeling that I had the first time I read all that vivid imagery and powerful, imagery from the book of Revelation. But just as a reminder, the gist of this currently unfolding vision, because remember, we're kind of picking up right where we left off. So the kind of what's happening as this vision's unfolding, it surrounds Jung's search for connection to the unconscious, or to God in religious terms, and his confrontation with the obstacles that are continuously popping up in his way. Now, prime among these obstacles are his own scientific, secular upbringing and training, and the resulting limiting worldview that creates. Now, this scientific skepticism and empiricism it's a perpetual thorn in the side of Jung's spiritual development. It creeps up again and again, like the proverbial devil on your left shoulder. He's following his intuition towards God in a day and age when God is chalked up to childish superstition. And he feels the weight of society's judgment against his quest and even his own self-judgment. But he follows his intuition anyway, because he senses the payoff to be immeasurably worth it, like the greatest possible good, what Jung will one day call wholeness. Now, the story continues where we left off. Jung is in the company of this great supernatural giant named Azdubar. Now remember, this is a vision that he's concocted in his mind. This is a dream unfolding, but he's aware and conscious in it, and he's interacting with the images and the scenes in his dreams as though he's really there in them. This is what I mean when I say it's something like a lucid dreaming. So he's there with Azdubar, this great supernatural giant. And what's happened is they basically met each other. They're both on their own quests. They're heading in opposite directions, and their paths basically cross. So this is when they bump into each other, and Jung is seeking the spiritual, unconscious, what he calls Eastern lands, right? The land where the sun originates, and the sun is the symbol of God. Like it's one of the oldest symbols of God. Think of Ra or Sol Invictus or something like that. And Azdubar is traveling the opposite direction. He's traveling west towards the conscious, towards the material. He's actually in chase of the sun, right? He's going to where the sun goes down. Jung is going to where the sun rises, and they meet in the middle, if you will. And this is all symbolic, by the way, because what we learned in the prior vision is that, Azdubar heading west and Jung, heading east or what have you, that this is actually one quest, and Jung and Azdubar are actually one being. And it's strange because Azdubar he represents God, essentially. He's the representation of God. And Jung is kind of discovering as this vision unfolds that the fantasy of this God being that he's, manifested in his mind, is identical to him. And so this trip, this journey that he's on going one way is the same, it's like the other side of the coin, right? Izdubar's headed one way, he's headed the other, they meet in the middle, but that journey is really just one journey and they're really one person. It's almost like the mirror image. You have this real material being, Carl Jung, and then you have this spiritual immaterial fantasy that represents God, Izdubar. So Jung represents the material, Izdubar represents the spiritual, and the truth of the matter is that these are two sides to one coin, and Jung's realized that he's both of them. But I get too far ahead of myself here. Okay, I am thinking about this idea of Jung coming one direction and Izdubar coming the other, and then meeting in the middle. It makes me think of a line of scripture from James chapter 4, which says, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you." And this is like what's happening. Jung is making the effort to go towards God, to seek God, and when he does that, what do you expect? God is doing the same, right, in the opposite direction. And this is the vision. This is the meaning of the unfolding vision. It's something like this: draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. All right, as you will recall, Jung actually injures Izdubar in the last division. He injures him mortally, like he is dying, okay? And how does he do that? Well, Jung actually tells Izdubar in kind of a off-the-cuff manner that the sun is in outer space, way out there, impossibly far away, never to be reached. Well, that's what Izdubar was trying to do. He was in search of the sun, seeking the sun. And when he learns this scientific truth, he's mortally wounded. Jung's scientific knowledge was deadly poison to Izdubar. Why? Well, because Izdubar represents the spiritual component of reality, which modern science has so gravely injured with its insistence that spirit doesn't and cannot exist. As Izdubar lays there dying, Jung's drowning in guilt, right? He's not only because he's responsible for Izdubar's condition, but because what Izdubar represents is exactly what he had been seeking all along. And now he's killed that thing, right? And Jung couldn't allow him to perish. And this is where today's vision starts, kind of right on the tail of that. And the chapter here is called Day 2, and it opens like this. So Jung is suggesting to Izdubar that he return to his eastern lands. Maybe that would cure him, right? He's trying to help him. So he's like, let's get you back to your spiritual lands. And Izdubar says, if you were strong as I am, you could carry me. But your poison can only destroy. Right? So he's saying you're insufficient, right? You can't take me to the eastern lands. It's far too dangerous, and I'm a giant. How do you possibly, how are you possibly going to help me? And he reminds him, he's like, all of your power coming from science, it's poison to me. It's what brought me low into this condition. How do you intend to help me with that? And then you get a little piece of like Jung's inner dialogue here, and he's like, what can be done? And then he says, Izdubar's hardly real in the ordinary sense, but he's a fantasy. He will, of course, not accept that he is a fantasy, but instead claim that he is completely real and that he can only be helped in a real way. Nevertheless, it would be worth trying this. I will appeal to him. And so Jung says to the giant, my prince, listen, a thought came to me that might save us. I think that you are not at all real, but only a fantasy. And Izdubar says, it is murderous. Do you mean to declare me unreal now that you have lamed me so? So this is Izdubar saying, what, have you come to finish me off? What do you mean I'm not real? And Jung says, I don't mean to say that you're not real at all, of course, but only as real as a fantasy. If you could accept this, much would be gained. And I want to stop here just for a second here, because remember, Jung is talking to his fantasy. The Izdubar a manifestation from his unconscious or whatever. It's a dream image in his head that he's creating and generating. So he understands better than anybody that a fantasy is real. He talks about archetypes as these transpersonal psychological forces. They don't exist in the material world. They're not made of atoms, and you can't measure them and so forth. But they're real. We experience them, and we're all under their power to one degree or another. It's something that's common to humanity. So in that regard, an archetype is something like a fantasy. And Jung would be the first one to tell you that doesn't mean that it's not real. And so this is an important thing when he says, I don't mean to say you're not real at all, but only as real as a fantasy. And so the important thing to remember here is Jung understands that a fantasy is real. It does have reality to it, even if it's not scientifically verifiable reality. There's something about fantasy. There's something about objects of the mind or objects of the psyche, immaterial, numinous things that are real. And we don't have to take, a mystical leap here. We can point to something that's much more grounded, like mathematics. Right? We would all agree, even the staunchest atheist, that mathematics are real, even though they don't correspond to any physical, material reality. You might put a couple of coconuts down on the ground and say, I have 1, 2, 3 coconuts. But the number 3 doesn't exist in the coconuts. But it's real nonetheless, as real as the coconuts themselves, right? So this is the point he's making about Izdubar as a fantasy, or this symbol of God, or the idea of God, that it has reality, even though it's a fantasy. But it turns out that being a fantasy gives us a little bit more leverage than dealing with the material world. There's some connection between consciousness and our experience of the world, and the power that consciousness holds to determine our experience, let's say. And so he says to Izdubar, if you would just accept that you're a fantasy, I think I could actually save you, all right? And Izdubar says, woe betide me, should it help me if I take myself for a fantasy? And Jung says, you know that the name one bears means a lot. You also know that one often gives the sick new names to heal them, for with the new name, they come by a new essence. Your name is your essence. Okay, so in some ways, what Carl Jung is saying is, come on, just do it. Just say you're a fantasy. Just go with me on this. But also, there's this idea that Jung can change God's essence by his will, right? Like I can turn God into a fantasy. Now that's strange, right? It implies that man has control over God in some fundamental way, that he can turn him into a fantasy. It also implies a kind of immortality to God, which we might expect. Now, he can be real or a fantasy, but he can't be nothing. He can't not exist. Like it has to be either reality or fantasy, and he's real in some way. And Izdubar says, you are right. Our priests also say this, right? So he's being convinced here. Jung says, so are you prepared to admit that you're a fantasy? And Izdubar says, if it helps, yes. So now an inner voice speaks to Jung, and it says, while admittedly he is a fantasy now, a fantasy cannot be simply negated and treated with resignation either. It calls for action. All right, so when he says that a fantasy can't be negated or treated with resignation, this is also something very fundamental to Jung's ideas. He says to negate God, it doesn't destroy God, right? It only pushes it into the unconscious. And this is a dangerous thing to do. If you're trying to get rid of God, like maybe an atheist might want to argue away from that idea, you're not actually doing away with it. Like it's part of you that's permanent, right? It's part of your psyche that's permanent. So to negate God doesn't do away with it. It just pushes it down into the unconscious. And its power over you doesn't cease there, right? This is the trick. It continues to work on you in the dark, as Jung might say. Now, Jung famously said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So the unconscious is where all the vital power is. It's where the living archetypes are. It's where the motivational forces live. It's the thing within you that moves you. It's you can connect it to your life and your consciousness and your intuitions and all of this stuff. So that's the unconscious. And you're putting God there. You're shoving this God down there, trying to get rid of it, right? But to do that, you're putting it in the place with the most power. You're putting it in the place with all the power, all the animating power, the life in you. That's where you're shoving it down. So it's a fantasy can't be negated or treated with resignation. Why? Because you're making it more dangerous by doing so. You're pushing it down into the unconscious. It's going to control you there, and you're not aware of it. You're not conscious of it, and you're going to call it fate, right? So this is what he's saying. This is what he's saying. You can't just pretend that God doesn't exist. All right, so he says, I went to Izdubar and said, you have become light, lighter than a feather. Now I can carry you. He says, I put my arms around him and lifted him up from the ground. And Jung says, once we have crossed the mountains and have reached the house of hospitable men, I can calmly go about finding a means to restore you. And then the journey continues, and eventually they come upon a secluded house. And Jung says, I hide Izdubar under the drooping branches of a tree, go up to the door of the house and knock. I ponder the door. It is much too small. I will never be able to get Izdubar through it. And then there's a epiphany that falls on him, and he goes, yet a fantasy takes up no space. Why did this excellent thought not occur to me earlier? I returned to the garden and with no difficulty squeeze Izdubar into the size of an egg and put him in my pocket. And then I walk into the welcome house where Izdubar should find healing. Thus my God found salvation. He was saved precisely by declaring him a figment of the imagination. How often has it been assumed that the gods have been brought to their end in this way? This was obviously a serious mistake, since this was precisely what saved the god. He did not pass away, but became a living fantasy, whose workings I could feel on my own body. Right? So he saved the god by turning him into a fantasy. And then he says, how often people think that they've destroyed God this way by turning him into a fantasy. But what a mistake, because there it goes down into the unconscious, where he says, I can feel the power of it in my own body. He didn't pass away, right? He goes on, he says, we clever men crept around, lamed and poisoned, and did not even know that we lacked something. Right? So what is he saying here? We clever men, he's talking about scientifically minded modern men like himself, like myself, like you, right? He says, we clever men crept around lamed and poisoned. Well, lamed and poisoned by scientific certainty, by scientific knowledge, by the insistence of empiricism, by the insistence of materialism and physicalism, all of this stuff that makes spirit impossible, that makes, the unconscious impossible, that sort of a thing. So this is the scientific poison that we carry around with us, and we're lamed by it. And he says, we did not even know that we lacked something. I'm just thinking of like Neil deGrasse Tyson here or something. Somebody who's so arrogantly certain that his scientific knowledge removes any mystery to the world, that it gives him certainty that there is no such thing as spirit or the supernatural or anything super physical, that sort of a thing. And the implication is that if you're open to these other possibilities, these things that science disallows and brushes off, if you're open to them, that might actually bring you something, that might actually give you a path that you wouldn't otherwise have. It might otherwise give you an experience or knowledge you might not otherwise have. That kind of a thing. He says, but I loved my God, and hence I experienced the miracle of my body losing its heaviness when I burdened myself with the God. Okay, so remember, he has this giant, literally a giant, covered in armor. This that represents God. This crazy, fantasy movie character, and he shrinks him down. He grabs him and shrinks him down to the size of an egg, and doesn't weigh anything anymore. Remember, he made him light as a feather, and he sticks him in his pocket. And what he experiences while he's carrying this, enormously, impossibly big giant, what he experiences is his own body losing its heaviness. Right? He becomes light after burdening himself with the God. That's what he says. He says, my burden lifted me up. And he says, we should be Christ's, for then our yoke is sweet and our burden easy. And that's a reference to Matthew 11:30. We should be Christ's. What does that mean? That means we should be the incarnation of God, right? We should imagine ourselves to have God in us, with us, in our proverbial pocket. And if we do, just like Jesus did, he believed that he was God, one with God, as he would say, one God in being, the incarnated deity. It's like, if we can think of ourselves like this, that we have God with us in the way Christ did, then our burden is easy. And you can imagine having God in you gives you something, right? It gives you some power, right? Have God in you rather than having this God outside of you as this impossibly large, terrifying force that makes you cower in fear, and in comparison to which you feel powerless and small, right? That's a very different thing than having God in you and having all that greatness at your disposal in you that makes you something more than science allows you to be. And then he says something super interesting. He says, this tangible and apparent world is one reality, but fantasy is the other reality. Right? So now he's talking again about how reality is a two-sided coin. Reality is a duality. Part of it is the material, physical world, but part of it is the psyche and fantasy world. And they're both real. They're both part of the same thing that we call reality, and you have to have them both. He says, the God outside of us increases the weight of everything heavy, while the God within us lightens everything heavy. And the God within us is all over the book of John, including John 14. This idea of indwelling, right? And we, as Christians, we're told, in Sunday school, that we're going to one day have the ability to welcome God or Jesus into our heart, where he lives, and indwelling. That's what we're talking about here. I'm just trying to make the connection. He says, therefore, if you are clever, take the God with you. Okay. Right? It's better to have God with you than to be this impossible thing outside of you. And this is also related to something very important that Carl Jung talked about. He talks about this idea of psychological projection. And what that idea really means is the things that are unconscious in you, you see in the world, right? You project them into people and into events and into objects in the world. So whatever's unconscious in you is out here as intimidating and contrasting with you. When you make those things conscious, you bring them in you. And so this is why the clever man takes God with you, so that he ceases to be a projection out here that's impossible and becomes something working for you, a part of you that's impossibly powerful, right? Take that with you if you have the choice. He says, secretly carry your God, embrace him lovingly until he has taken on the form of his first beginning. Do not speak, but sit in a solitary place and sing incantations in this ancient manner. Set the egg before you, the God in his beginning, and behold it. and incubate it with the magical warmth of your gaze. All right, pump the brakes for a second. All right, so he says, secretly carry your God, right? Bring him into you, make him conscious, make him a part of you. Embrace him lovingly until he has taken on the form of his first beginning, right? This is an allusion to that egg again, right? An egg is something like a beginning. It hatches, right? And something new comes. So you've made God into the symbol of what God was in the beginning. And he says, don't speak, sit there, sing to the egg, right? Sing these incantations to the egg. And here's the craziest part. He says, and behold it and incubate it with the magical warmth of your gaze. What does that mean? Like to look at something is to bring your attention to it, right? It's to focus your consciousness on it. So what he's saying that you do is you take God in the form of an egg and you incubate it with your consciousness, right? You're going to pour your consciousness into it, and this is what's going to warm it and cause it to hatch and allow God to return, right? And there's all kinds of symbolism there, Christian and otherwise, about the dying and reborn God. And when he says incubate it with consciousness, I can't help but be reminded of that famous Jungian phrase, to make the unconscious conscious. The other thing that I want to say is this idea of God in an egg is just ripe with symbolism. God as an egg is one of our earliest ideas of one of our earliest cosmological ideas. So we have these stories about how the cosmos came to be. And in our earliest religious stories, it's depicted as an egg. Okay, so I've talked about this before, but in the Rig Veda, this is 10.121, there's a creation story there called the golden embryo or the golden egg. And this is God in the beginning as the embryo that is everything. That's what the scripture says. Or Brahmanda is a Hindu word or a Sanskrit word, Brahmanda, which means the cosmic egg. The Taoists in China, ancient China, they have a similar myth of Pangu, this primordial god that becomes the cosmos, and he begins in an egg. And of course, the ancient Egyptians have something super similar, where in the creation myth that comes from Hermopolis, Ra, or the sun, is born from a cosmic egg. Like all the primordial gods create this egg. The great god Ra is born from it. And then we see echoes of that in kind of ancient Greek myth, even kind of before the classical period, from these Orphic myths, where the primordial god is called Phanes, the firstborn shiner, and he is hatched from an egg. So in all of these instances, you see this deeply and kind of universal, right, all over the world, stories of the cosmos being born from an egg. And this is exactly the imagery that we see in the vision. All right, that brings me to, I think, one of the most interesting parts of this vision, which is just going to be called the incantations. So remember, we've placed this God in an egg in front of us. We're incubating it with our consciousness, and we're singing incantations. So here are the incantations that we're singing. And what I want to get you to focus on here, and this is going to be clear, that Jung is describing God in a paradoxical way. And we see it like in Zen koans, we see it in the East, where God is described in these sort of paradoxical ways. But we see it in the Bible too, like God is the beginning and the end, that sort of thing. But it's this very ancient idea of the Ouroboros, of this idea of God as the union of opposites. And this is the idea of God in its beginning. In its beginning, before the cosmos was separated out from the oneness, God is the one, the monad, the all, the everything. That's the egg. And until things are separated from that egg, or the egg is hatched and things come out of it, God is one thing, right? So all things are together. It's the union of opposites. And what the union of opposites is something creative, right? It's something that creates. When the opposites are in union, when God is in this stage of monad, you've got nothing but creation happening. So bring opposites together causes this creative act, and then when the egg is separated, all the creative things come out. And we see that myth in, the Anew in ancient Mesopotamia. We see it everywhere. So the incantations, this is what's being sung. And this is about God as a paradox, or God as the Ouroboros. Listen to how Jung crafts this. Imagine we're sitting down, staring at this egg, which we know is to be filled with God. And we're incubating it with our consciousness. And this is what we're singing to the egg. Christmas has come. The God is in the egg. He is the eternal emptiness and the eternal fullness. Nothing resembles him, and he resembles everything. Eternal darkness and eternal brightness, eternal below and eternal above, double nature in one. Simple in the manifold, meaning in absurdity. Rise up, you gracious fire of old night. I kiss the threshold of your beginning. Rise up, break through the shell. We carry up what is below and we turn what is above into what is below as you command. I'm going to pump the brakes here because it goes on, but you kind of get the idea. Is the hair standing up on your arms yet? Because it's standing up on mine. Okay. Christmas has come. God is in the egg, right? Christmas has come. This is the day that God is born, that Christ is born, right? So this is the day the egg hatches, right? That's what he's saying. And in the egg, he says he is eternal emptiness and eternal fullness, right? Alpha and Omega. So you can see the paradox there. Nothing resembles him, right? Nothing is God, but he resembles everything, right? Nothing is God, but God is in everything. That's what he's saying, right? Paradox. Eternal darkness and eternal brightness, eternal above and below, double nature in one. This is what he's saying, the opposites together. But you might wonder what the double nature is. And he said something a bit ago that I think points to this. Remember, he said the tangible and apparent world is one reality, but fantasy is the other reality, right? So you have the material and the psychic or the spiritual. So the double nature in one is this. This is the idea. Fantasy and world, material and spiritual, something like that. And then he says simple in the manifold, which is another way of talking about a perennial philosophical problem of the one in the many. Simple in the manifold means that he's one in manyness, right? He's both one and many. Then he says meaning and absurdity. So you get the idea. How can you be both one and many? How can you be both empty and full? How can you be, right? This is what he's saying. And he says, rise up, you gracious fire of old night, right? Even that fire of night, paradox. I kiss the threshold of your beginning. Rise up, break through your shell. And then he says, what we carry up is below, and we turn what is above into what is below as you command. So he's talking about God giving us this duty. What is that duty? Well, something we've already talked about, to make the unconscious conscious. And that's what we're doing in a sense, raising the God from this unconscious state back into the conscious one. Whereas Jordan Peterson might say, rather than making conscious from the unconscious, he would say making order from chaos. Same idea. All right, he goes on, he says, come to us, we who are willing from our own will. Come to us, we who understand you from our own spirit. Come to us, we who will produce you out of our own body. Come, child, to father and mother. All right, so we're gonna produce the God out of our own body. And then he says, come, child. He's talking to God, remember. And he says, come, child, to father and mother. He's talking to God as his own child, right? Right. So God is the child born from us. We are its father and mother, right? Jung said, meaning and absurdity, right? For sure. Given that God is our creator, how can we be its father and mother? Paradox. See what I mean? But as a fantasy or an idea or an ideal, God lives in us in a very real way. He is real and alive through us, just as we exist through him. Something like that. All right, the incantation kind of wraps like this. He says, my God, I love you as a mother loves the unborn whom she carries in her heart. Grow in the egg of the East. Nourish yourself from my love. Drink the juice of my life so that you will become a radiant God. We need your light, O child. Since we go in darkness, light up our paths. May your light shine before us. May your fire warm the coldness of our life. Just as the greening earth and every living body needs the sun, so we as spirits need your light and your warmth. A sunless spirit becomes the parasite of the body, but the God feeds the spirit. All right, so this is the end of the incantation. Now, I love this bit where he says, grow in the egg of the east. Then he says, nourish yourself from my love. Drink the juice of my life, right? So my love and my life are pouring into the egg. Why? So that you will become a radiant God. So again, I'm reminded of scripture, John 4:16, where he says, he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. So when he says, nourish yourself from my love, I can't help but think about this idea. God is love. Having love is to have God within you, and right? So you're in God and God is in you. This also reminds me of this biblical idea, maybe more of an Orthodox idea or a Catholic idea of kenosis or self-emptying, which is something that Jesus is shown to have done, psychologically emptying himself when he says things like, not my will, but your will be done, that kind of a thing, to be filled with God so that he can act in the world as God. So emptying ourselves so that God can act through us, in a sense. And when I've thought about this idea in the past, I never really asked into what we're emptying ourselves, right? Like we empty ourselves to be filled with God, but into what are we emptying ourselves? I never really thought about that. And Jung tells us here, it's into God. That's where we're emptying ourselves. We empty ourselves into God and are filled by God, right? We fill ourselves just as God pours into our emptied self, something like that. So again, you see this mutual counterdependence, right? This is like God creates man and we create God, as Jung just described. You've got this mutual counterdependence. You can't have one without the other. God and man, we need each other, right? And he says so. We need your light, O child, since we go in darkness. And that brings me to the next chapter, which is called Opening of the Egg. And it starts like this. On the evening of the third day, I kneel down on the rug and carefully open the egg. Okay, well, I'll stop there just for a second to say this is significant that the egg is opening on the third day. And you might wonder what I mean by that, but just strictly from a biblical perspective, Jesus, when he's crucified and dies, he resurrects on the third day, right? He's supposed to have gone into Hades for 3 days and then come back to life. So what's happening here is on the third day, Jung is carefully opening this egg. It says, something resembling smoke rises up, and suddenly Isobar is standing before me, enormous, transformed, and complete. He says, where am I? Where was I? It seemed to me as if I swam in a sea that wrapped me in living fires. Full of light, full of longing, full of eternity. I was hovering around myself amidst glowing clouds, embracing and rejecting myself in a boundless game. I was completely sun. I am the sun. All right, so to say I am the sun is to say I am God. Remember, sun is the symbol of God that we've been seeing over and over again. There's a footnote on this page, by the way, that just says the incubation and rebirth of Izdubar follows the classic pattern of solar myths, right? Solar myths, like in the ancient Egyptian story, the sun goes down and the God is the sun, right? The solar hero. He goes down into the underworld and he's fighting the dragon of chaos, Apophis, before defeating him and being reborn again in the east, right? So this is the solar myth, and it requires a sort of death and rebirth symbolism. And this is exactly what's played out with Izdubar and Jung. Again, also an example of this is the example of Jesus and the dying and reborn God. He says, an inexpressible light breaks from his body, a light that my eyes cannot grasp. I cover my face and cast my gaze to the ground. Everything is quiet and dark. I look around me. The empty shell is lying on the rug. When I conquered the god, his force streamed into me. But when the god rested in the egg, my force went into him. All right, so you can see what I mean. He says, when I conquered the god, well, what did he do to conquer the god? Well, he turned him into a fantasy, didn't he? So he made the god, in some sense, unconscious. And when he did that, his force streamed into me. So you've got this mutual back and forth of God's force streaming into Jung and Jung's life force streaming into God. And so you see this Ouroboros. God and man are the opposites now, and they're mutually counterdependent. They're opposites in union, right? This is the paradoxical Ouroboros idea. And I can't help but suggest that what we see here is something like what the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead described as his model of reality, in a sense, which is centered on consciousness. He calls his metaphysics process philosophy or process metaphysics, because to him, the process of the world, the cosmos, is a process. Okay, so it's something happening, a back and forth, a feedback, some kind of a process happening. And that feedback, that back and forth, is between those opposites, God and man, or creator and creation, something like that. Consciousness and itself, as Whitehead might say it. And that brings us to the final section we're going to talk about today, which is called hell. And it goes like this. On the second night after the creation of my God, a vision made known to me that I had reached the underworld. Okay, now I'm going to paraphrase for a minute. So what Jung sees here is this gloomy underworld scene filled with bodies and monsters and gore. He sees a strange thing. Like, he sees this, what he calls a wonderful red gold-haired maiden, right? So in the midst of all of this torment and gloominess and gore and disgust, he sees this one beautiful woman. And she represents Carl Jung's own soul. Now, she's been overrun by these corpse-like devils. They have her in their grasp. And he's studying the scene. He's trying to figure out what's going on. And he realizes that the monsters, while they have her, they won't kill her. And the reason becomes apparent when he notices that she holds onto a fishing pole and she has this stabbed through the eye of one of the monsters. And with one wrong move, right, she can easily pluck the eye right out of this monster. And this is why the monster didn't finish her, right? This is why he hasn't killed her, because she has him by the balls, right? He didn't move, the monster, because he didn't want to lose his eye, right? And Jung says, the horror paralyzes me. What will happen? A voice speaks. The evil one cannot make a sacrifice. He cannot sacrifice his eye. Victory is with the one who can sacrifice. And then the vision vanishes, right? So we'll pump the brakes for just a second here. The evil one cannot make a sacrifice. He won't sacrifice his eye, right? So that's how Jung's soul has held by the short and curlies, you might say. And so the devil can't sacrifice his eye. Well, this is in contradistinction to God, right? God sacrifices himself in the person of Jesus. All of those stories I told you before about the egg, the primordial God hatching out of the egg. These are gods that are literally sacrificing themselves to become the cosmos and to become you and I. So you have this thing that's being repeated in this contrast being pointed to, that God sacrifices and the devil is incapable of sacrifice. Voluntary self-sacrifice, really, that's the story of Jesus. That's the Christian morality, in a sense. But this idea of sacrificing his eye is, again, it's filled with other mythological meaning. I'm reminded of the Norse god Odin, who's, famously wears an eye patch because he's only got one eye. Why? Well, he voluntarily sacrifices his own eye in order to discover the magic of runes. This is one of the ancient Norse stories, myths. Odin is also, by the way, the god who hangs on the world tree, Yggdrasil, as a sacrifice to himself. So Odin is God sacrificing himself to himself, and by hanging on the tree. And again, when you start seeing this imagery of the eye and sacrificing the eye, it immediately creates this constellation of symbols, Odin being one of them. And this idea of voluntary self-sacrifice and hanging on the tree tie right back to Christ and the crucifixion. And Jung says, because I wanted to give birth to my God, I also wanted evil. He who wants to create an eternal fullness will also create eternal emptiness. You cannot undertake one without the other. Therefore, we also need evil. Everything in me strives against this abysmal abomination, for I still do not know what it means to give birth to a God. All right, that's how it ends. That's how it wraps. So I guess what I want to say here is that Jung is coming to terms here. He's confronting this paradox. And you can tell that he's struggling with it because he understands about this idea of emptiness and fullness and creator and creation and this union of opposites, Ouroboros idea. He gets all of this. But when it comes right down to it, when he's created, he's incubated the egg, he's given God new life, he's brought it back. He realizes that by bringing God, he also brings the devil, right? And there's no way around it, because if you want eternal fullness, it comes with eternal emptiness, right? The opposites are one, and so you can't have one without the other. And this is why he says, therefore we need evil. And then here's the kind of the really gripping bit, is that this is honesty coming from Jung in this moment. He says, everything in me strives against this abysmal abomination. What abomination? The necessity of evil. We can't have God without the devil. We can't have good without evil. So to have God, to have good, which we want and need, it means we must also have evil and emptiness and all of that. And he says, I still don't know what it means to give birth to a God. He is struggling with this himself. He's lost in the mystery, deep as he can be, up to his eyeballs in it. And that brings me to my conclusion. As you can see, perhaps most clearly in this vision of hell, Jung struggled mightily with the paradox inherent in the Godhead. It wasn't just about reconciling contradictions, like when he speaks of eternal fullness and eternal emptiness, but the more practical reality that somehow good requires evil, or God the devil. And worse than that, that they are somehow paradoxically one. This instinct, a hangover from his Christian upbringing, I'm sure, forced him to keep God and the devil in tidy little boxes. And as a consequence, he could find no entry for himself in that God box either. As much as this seemed to Jung appropriate, and as much as scientific orthodoxy supported it, he could not shake the need to find God, to discover him. And so he pushed deeper into paradox. This is where he begins to find his footing, and when the story unfolding in his vision begins to progress finally, he questions the very nature of reality, of what is real. He expands it, saying, quote, this is the tangible world. This is one reality, but fantasy is the other. And so what is real is more than material reality. It's also psychic reality, the mind, fantasy, and of course it is. Objects of the mind like ideas, like numbers, like qualia. These are very much real, although they can't be weighed or measured. See, God is something of this sort. As the vision unfolds, Jung's interaction with Eisdebar becomes a direct analogy to the state of modern mankind. Jung turns Eisdebar into a fantasy, exactly as modern man has done to the idea of God and our collective consciousness. But they work towards opposite ends. See, modernity turns God into a fantasy in order to destroy it. Jung, on the other hand, turns God into a fantasy in order to save it. And you might wonder just how the hell turning God into a fantasy could possibly save it. And you're right to wonder. But remember, we're talking about Carl Jung here. To him, becoming a fantasy implies something more than the surface level. It does not mean to render God false or non-existent, but rather to push the idea into the unconscious. And this is where all vital force comes from, where consciousness comes from. The unconscious is the immaterial foundation of psyche, full stop. There is no mind without it, no experience without it, no world without it. So to put God there means something very, very different. It means placing God back in its proper place. It means giving God life by bringing it into the living and making God real by bringing it within my own reality. The great philosopher Alfred North Whitehead saw reality constituted exactly this way. He understood reality to be a self-created, self-contained process operating between and within itself. Consciousness within consciousness within consciousness. Okay, imagine a series of Russian nesting dolls and you've got the gist. And famously, Whitehead described how immaterial reality, fantasy if you will, becomes real in a process he calls prehension. What is that? What is prehension? Wouldn't you know it? It's exactly what Jung described. It is bringing the unreal into the real in order to make it real. It's ontological incorporation, making the unconscious conscious, right? And again, I'm reminded of John chapter 4, which describes us abiding in God and God in us. Now, once the fantasy enters into us, once the idea of God has been pushed into the unconscious, what happens? In Jung's vision, this is when Eisdebar has been condensed down into a cosmic egg, what he calls God's beginning. What happens in the vision? Jung incubates the egg by concentrating on it, doesn't he? His consciousness becomes the mother hen, so to speak. His consciousness is the thing that incubates it. And this is what happens when we make God into a fantasy. You think you've removed the idea from your head, but you've only pushed it deeper inside of you. While God remains in the egg, in the unconscious, it is incubated by our life, by our consciousness. As Jung said in his incantation, nourish yourself from my love. Drink the juice of my life so that you will become a radiant God. You see, making God a fantasy transforms not only what God is, but what we are. When God becomes a fantasy, we become its pregnant mother. God grows in us until the time comes for its rebirth. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that the West has kept God inside its egg long enough. Surely by now our collective consciousness is swollen with child and rent with labor pains. Shall I light the cigar?
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.